When you survey the landscape of Washington, D.C., one object stands out, towering above the rest: the obelisk known as the Washington Monument. Do you know what's buried at the base of the monument, put there by those who built it to honor the memory of the father of our country? Did you know that there are several scripture verses in plaques to be found in the stairwells, which now, unfortunately, are closed to the public? What's at the very top of the Washington Monument? More than a decade ago, I had the privilege to be interviewed by Kirk Cameron about the Washington Monument and our nation's Christian roots. The Washington Monument is 555 feet high. When it was completed in 1884, it was the tallest building in the world at that time.
Jerry?
It's nice to finally meet you. Jerry,
Good to meet you too.
Good to meet you. Kirk,
Thank you.
That's great. Well, let's go up to the monument. There's a lot to
In August
show,
2010, I had the privilege to be interviewed by Kirk Cameron on the grounds of the Washington Monument. This footage has not been seen before. We did the interview after we went up to the top of the monument.
Spring. Yeah. This whole little basin here by the Jefferson Memorial.
This is the first time that I got to go inside of the Washington Monument, and
I did as a kid.
Did you?
Yeah, it was fun. I even walked all up all the stairs.
Well, that's what I was looking forward to going up, because I've heard that there are some beautiful plaques and stones with things inscribed on it that really speak to the real secret of America and the beliefs that gave rise to the freedom. But they didn't let us see it, right? We went in the elevator, 2 minutes you're at the top, but the windows are fogged out and you can't read them.
There's 189 plaques inside the walls of the Washington Monument, and they've been gifts from states, from cities, from different groups and so forth. And some of them are Christian in nature. They have Bible verses such as holiness to the Lord. There's one that says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. There's another one that says, search the scriptures. And so they're just reminders of our godly heritage.
And they were given to the monument by whom?
Just different groups.
Also significant is a tiny aluminum plaque at the very top of the Washington Monument.
And what it says in Latin is Laus Deo, which is praise be to God. And I think George Washington would have been very pleased with that. Of course, this monument was completed in 1885. George Washington was long dead, but George Washington lived his life in such a way that he trusted in God. He trusted in God, whom we also often refer to as Providence. In fact, Dr. Peter Lobeck, chief author of a book I co-wrote with him called George Washington and Sacred Fire, he took the time to count the number of times that George Washington used the phrase providence, or the word providence talking about God, 270 times. And then he also uses the word God 100 times, and the word Lord is used there many, many times. George Washington was a dedicated Christian, and God meant everything to him. And there's many times where he writes in both public writings and in private writings where he talks about the hand of God. For example, he was in a battle, 1755. He had a couple of horses shot out, killed underneath him. All of the British officers were killed. In fact, he was the most ranking officer that was left, that survived that battle. It was a rout, really. And by torchlight, he used the Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which George Washington read all the time. And he read from the scriptures to give the funeral for General Braddock, who died. And the very opening of that funeral service from the Anglican churches, I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. It's a quote directly from John 11. The very quote you see at George Washington's crypt to this day. George Washington quoted from the scriptures all the time. Now, there was a man, a scholar, who wrote a book about George Washington trying to say he wasn't a Christian. And one of his arguments is he hardly ever quoted the Bible. Well, that just shows the lack of knowledge of the Bible of that gentleman. Because in our book, Sacred Fire, we have an appendix where we have phrases that come directly from the pages of Scripture that George Washington used. And there's it's about 100 of them or whatever.
Right.
It's almost as if you cut George Washington, he bled Scripture. And it's He uses these phrases, many of them over and over and over. Like every man should live under his own vine and fig tree. He loved that quote from Micah. He just loved it and used it a lot. He looked at that as a picture of what would be right about America. That we would have the freedom under God to live our lives in peace.
Kirk Cameron also asked me a little about the construction of this tall structure and what was in the time capsule in the cornerstone of the Washington Monument.
In 1848, the president at the time was James Polk, and he laid the cornerstone for this monument. The whole purpose of the monument is to honor the memory of George Washington, who's the father of our country, who was the first president under the Constitution, and was a godly Christian man, and was a great leader. And he was also somebody that when he had opportunity to abuse power, he pushed it away. And it takes a big man to do that. And he even said, as you can read up there in the Washington Monument, "I have no lust after power." He did not want to grab power unto himself. Instead, he was a Christian servant leader. Like Jesus, who washed the feet of his disciples, George Washington was a Christian servant leader. And that's really important. Let me give you an example. Yorktown was the unofficial end of the war between us and Great Britain, 1781. But the official freedom, the official treaty, was not until 1783. So there's a 2-year period there where George Washington said, let's keep the troops around just in case. Now, meanwhile, in 1783, when we had the official freedom with Great Britain, that was under the Treaty of Paris. John Adams and Ben Franklin, those were two of the, and John Jay, those are three of the men that actually dealt with the Treaty of Paris. It starts in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Wow, that's our document of freedom, 1783, Treaty of Paris, between the United States and Great Britain. And there was a meeting with George Washington and his troops, and there were actually some among them that wanted him to become their king. You become their king, we'll follow you, we'll make sure, we'll enforce this around the country. And George Washington pushed away power. He said, I didn't fight one king in order to become another king. So it takes a great Christian man to do that, but George Washington was that kind of leader. And he was loved by everybody. He was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. As Richard Henry Lee said at his funeral, which was at Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia.
Isn't there something underneath the monument?
Yes, in 1848, when they laid the cornerstone, the president, James Polk, they had a time capsule there, and one of the things they had there was the Holy Bible. I think that's so fitting to think that a monument dedicated to the memory of George Washington would actually have the Holy Bible, which is Washington's favorite book. That and the 1662 Book of Common Prayer.
You've been watching rare footage of an interview Kirk Cameron conducted with me as the co-author of the book with Dr. Peter Loback, George Washington's Sacred Fire. By the grace of God, that book became a bestseller. Perhaps the highest compliment we ever heard about the book was when a tour guide at a prominent church George Washington used to worship at for the last decade of his life said, "Thank you for writing this book. You gave George Washington back to the church." Well, he had never left the church. Only revisionist historians had crafted a different narrative about the father of our country. And it's a false narrative that must be diligently corrected. For Providence Forum, I'm Jerry Newcombe.